Welcome to Wisconsin's American Rescue Plan Act, or ESSER III plan presentation. I'm Laura Adams, Education Consultant at the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction. In this presentation, I will be providing some background information, including an overview of ESSER III federal funds, a timeline of actions that have occurred to date, and details on both the components of Wisconsin's ESSER III plan that have already been approved and those components that are under modification. Wisconsin has received 3 stimulus packages to support students and schools as they deal with the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. The first stimulus package is known as the CARES Act, and that went into law in March of 2020. The second stimulus package is known as the Coronavirus Response and Relief Supplemental Appropriations Act. That went into law in December of 2020. And the third stimulus package, which is the one that we are here to talk about today, is known as the American Rescue Plan Act, or ESSER III, and that went into law in March of 2021. The American Rescue Plan Act is not just ESSER funding to school districts and independent charters. These are the additional components of the American Rescue Plan Act. You can see details about each of these different programs on DPI's ESSER III page. One important term to know throughout this presentation is LEA. That's a term you're going to be hearing me say quite a bit. LEA stands for Local Education Agency, and what I'm referring to when I say that term are both public school districts and independent charter schools. Here's a timeline of activities related to these federal ESSER III funds. In October, per state law, DPI submitted its initial ESSER III plan to the Wisconsin Joint Committee on Finance. That plan you can find the details of if you follow this hyperlink here on the screen. At the end of May, that state legislative body modified the plan through Wisconsin Motion 57, which prescribed what DPI should do with the state set-aside portion of ESSER III funds. In July, the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction engaged stakeholders to further develop both the state plan and implementation of that plan based on Wisconsin Motion 57. At the end of August, after taking that public input into account, DPI submitted the state plan, including Wisconsin Motion 57, to the U.S. Department of Education. In October, after reviewing our state plan, the U.S. Department of Education contacted DPI seeking some clarification and additional data. And in November, early November, DPI responded to those questions. Then in December, the U.S. Department of Education approved part of Wisconsin's ESSER III state plan. DPI then sought clarity from the U.S. Department of Education regarding the details of that partial approval. Because DPI had full authority to go ahead and release 90% of the ESSER III funds to our LEAs, we went ahead and did that. An important deadline to note is that per federal law, every LEA must submit their initial ESSER III plan and budget by March 11 of 2022. The Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction is currently working with both the Wisconsin Joint Committee on Finance per state law and the U.S. Department of Education per federal law to finalize the remainder of that plan. And you're going to hear some details about that in this presentation today. At the same time that DPI was creating the state plan, responding to inquiries, and making necessary revisions, DPI was also supporting LEAs through the creation and publication of various resources related to specific ESSER III requirements and in response to questions and feedback from LEAs about their needs. You can find all of these different resources at DPI's ESSER 3 page. The link is found at the bottom of this slide. Wisconsin's total ESSER 3 award for K-12 education is just over $1.5 billion. These funds are divided into two separate pots. The largest pot makes up 90% of Wisconsin's ESSER 3 allocation and goes directly to LEAs in the form of formula grants. Per federal law, each LEA receives an ESSER 3 formula grant based on its Title I Part A allocation. The smaller pot makes up 10% of Wisconsin's ESSER 3 allocation and is the money set aside for state level use. There are additional federal requirements both for our LEAs and at the state level in how these funds may be used. Since today we're really just talking about that 10%, that state reservation portion, that's where we're going to focus our attention. Federal requirements for that 10% of the state ESSER 3 funds include the fact that a minimum of 5% must be used to support the impacts of lost instructional time through the implementation of evidence-based improvement strategies at the state level. A minimum of 1% must be used to implement summer learning opportunities. A minimum of 1% must be used to implement after or before school learning programs. And the remaining 3% may be used at the state's discretion, but it must fall under this broad federal requirement that all ESSER 3 funds, whether at the state level or at the LEA level, must be used to prepare for, plan for, or respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. A state may also use some of these funds for administrative support to manage and implement all of the requirements. At this time, part of Wisconsin's plan for the use of that 10% state set aside portion of ESSER 3 funds has been approved by the federal government, and part of it must be revised. The components of the state plan created by the Wisconsin Legislative Joint Committee on Finance and already approved by the U.S. Department of Education are the following: approximately $15 million for competitive grants for summer learning opportunities, approximately $15 million for competitive grants for after or before school learning opportunities, approximately $5 million for reading initiative activities, and approximately $37.6 million in supplementary funds to LEAs based on their in-person instructional hours in school year 2020 to 2021. Note that both the summer learning and after or before school learning opportunity grants fulfill that federal requirement that states reserve at least 1% of their funds for those activities. Per Wisconsin Motion 57, DPI will be distributing those grants in two rounds, with the first round open only to LEAs who are eligible for sparsity aid. Note that the supplementary funds based on in-person instructional hours must follow that federal requirement of planning for, preparing for, or responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. Note that while the activities for the reading initiatives have been approved, the timelines need to be revised in order to allow a time for implementation due to legally required state processes and federal deadlines. These are the components of the state plan created by the Wisconsin Legislative Joint Committee on Finance that have not been approved by the U.S. Department of Education and therefore require modification. As I just said, one of the items that requires modification are the dates and the timelines for the reading initiatives. The other component of the plan that requires modification is the plan to meet the federal requirement of spending 5% of a state's reservation to address unfinished learning through evidence based improvement strategies implemented at the state level. The original plan to provide additional supplementary funds to LEAs to address unfinished learning based on in-person instructional hours must also be revised. Let's take a look at each one of these components to be modified in turn. The content of the plan for spending approximately $5 million on reading initiatives has been approved, but the dates and timelines for these initiatives need to be revised to allow time for implementation due to legally required state processes as well as federal deadlines. These initiatives include directing money to our regional service providers, known as CESAs, to provide specific professional learning in reading, directing money to our LEAs to attend specific professional learning and reading, directing money to a vendor to conduct an analysis of reading coursework for pre-service teachers who are attending UW schools, and then providing grants to any UW schools that want to revise their reading coursework for their pre-service teachers based on the results of that analysis. As previously mentioned, there's a federal requirement of directing 5% of a state's reservation of ESSER III funds to address unfinished learning through evidence-based improvement strategies. 5% of Wisconsin's state reservation totals about $77 million. DPI is proposing to break that $77 million in 3 ways. 2 of those are discussed here on this slide, and that third will be discussed in the next. First, Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction is proposing modifying this portion of the plan to direct approximately $5 million to competitive grants to fund additional evidence-based before school or after school learning opportunities. DPI already operates an existing federal grant to fund out of school learning opportunities. And each year, DPI is unable to fund all of the requests for these programs. The need to provide additional out of school learning opportunities to support our students in addressing unfinished learning is greater than ever. These grants would be directed both to LEAs as well as to community-based organizations who are able to provide evidence-based before school and after school learning opportunities. Second, to direct approximately $5 million to Graduation Alliance, an organization that works with states and districts to identify students who ceased attending and have not returned to school during the COVID-19 pandemic. This organization finds these chronically absent students, connects them with a personal academic coach, who then works with those students to re-engage them with school and helps get them back on track to high school graduation. In order to meet that federal requirement of that minimum of 5% of state funds to evidence-based improvement strategies, DPI is proposing the remaining $67 million of these funds to be awarded in this way. DPI is proposing to direct that approximately $67 million in remaining ESSER III funds to provide additional supplementary ESSER III funds to LEAs who received less than $578 per pupil in their initial 3 ESSER III allocations. The department proposes an approach to distributing these funds with a combination of a per pupil minimum guarantee and a minimum amount to very small LEAs. You can see the details broken down here on this slide. If an LEA's initial ESSER III grant was less than $578 per pupil, DPI would then provide additional funds to raise their ESSER III formula grant to $578 per pupil. DPI would also guarantee that a minimum amount is $320,863. Wisconsin, also has some very small LEAs. So DPI is also proposing that for those very small LEAs that have fewer than 25 pupils total, they would also be guaranteed $200,000 in ESSER III formula grant funds. Note that in order to meet the federal requirement, these funds may only be spent on addressing unfinished learning through evidence-based improvement strategies. DPI knows that no matter how big or how small, and no matter the socioeconomic status of the majority of students, every LEA in the state has been impacted by COVID-19. These funds would ensure that every LEA has the funds that they need in order to address those needs that have been caused by the pandemic. So now DPI is seeking your feedback. We're looking for your voice and your opinion on the proposed modifications to the plan, understanding the federal and state guidelines that we're working with. We're wondering how a $5 million before school or after school program could serve your district and community. We're wondering how $5 million to identify and re-engage chronically absent students across the state of Wisconsin and get them back on track to high school graduation could serve your district and community. And we're wondering how additional supplementary funds to address unfinished learning could serve your district and community. On this slide, underneath the image of those little speech bubbles, you can see the address for where you can find the survey to make your voice heard. Your opinion matters, and it will help us in crafting a plan that makes sense for you and your district, your community, as well as how we can implement it to serve your needs. I want to thank you for your time today in attending to this information, in completing the survey. Wisconsin schools are important. We know that a free and public education supports us all in becoming a better community. Thank you.